You know that moment when you're sitting in a conversation and suddenly realize you're the quietest person in the room, not because you have nothing to say, but because the things people are worrying about seem strangely distant to you. Someone is frustrated about a small inconvenience. Someone else is excited about something that feels temporary or superficial. And while you listen, there's a subtle feeling that you're observing the moment from slightly outside of it. Not in a detached way, just with a different kind of perspective. It can feel like you're somehow out of sync with the timeline everyone else seems to be following. Almost like you're living at a slightly different emotional age than the number on your birthday. Most people never talk about this experience directly, but people who feel it often hear similar descriptions from others. They're told they're too serious, or that they're an old soul. Sometimes people describe them as unusually mature. Other times, the interpretation is less generous. They might be seen as distant, overly thoughtful, or someone who struggles to simply relax and be present. And over time, hearing these kinds of labels can create a quiet question in the background of someone's mind. Why does it feel like everyone else is moving through life at one emotional speed while I seem to be moving at another? What's interesting is that psychology has quietly studied this experience for decades, not under the phrase emotionally older than your age, but through several overlapping ideas in developmental psychology and neuroscience. One of them involves something called accelerated emotional processing. Research in developmental psychology has shown that certain people begin interpreting social and emotional information earlier and more deeply than their peers. Their brains start noticing patterns in behavior, relationships, and consequences sooner, while others might still be focused on immediate experiences, fun, excitement, exploration. These individuals are already tracking meaning. They're asking internal questions like, why do people react that way? What does this situation actually mean? What happens next? And this shift often happens quietly, without anyone around them realizing it. From the outside, it simply looks like a child or teenager who seems unusually reflective. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. The brain systems responsible for emotional awareness and pattern recognition are working overtime. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as heightened integration between emotional processing areas like the limbic system and regions responsible for reflection and interpretation, such as parts of the prefrontal cortex. In simple terms, some people begin processing life experiences through a deeper emotional lens earlier than others. And when that happens, the world can start to feel different. Moments that feel temporary to others may feel significant. Conflicts that others brush off may feel like important lessons about human behavior. Even everyday conversations can feel layered with meaning that others don't seem to notice. But this difference rarely appears out of nowhere. In many cases, it develops through early experiences that quietly encourage emotional awareness. Sometimes it comes from growing up in environments where paying attention to people's moods and reactions mattered. A child who learns to read emotional signals early to notice tension, disappointment, or subtle shifts in tone often develops a kind of internal radar for human behavior. Other times, it comes from life circumstances that require someone to process complex feelings earlier than most people do. Moments of responsibility, periods of uncertainty, situations where understanding people becomes necessary. The nervous system adapts to these environments. It becomes skilled at observation, interpretation, and emotional anticipation. Over time, this skill can create the feeling of being emotionally ahead of one's age. But here's something important that often gets misunderstood. Feeling emotionally older doesn't mean someone is wiser, stronger, or more advanced than other people. And it doesn't mean others are immature. Human development simply doesn't move along one single track. Some people spend more time exploring the world outwardly through action, novelty, and experience. Others spend more time exploring it inwardly through reflection, observation, and emotional understanding. Neither path is better. They simply lead to different perspectives at different stages of life. In fact, people who feel emotionally older often experience a quiet paradox. On one hand, they may find it easier to understand complex emotions, both in themselves and in others. They can sense when something isn't being said directly. They notice the underlying tone of conversations. They can often see long-term consequences in situations where others are focused on the present moment. But that same depth can come with a subtle cost. Because when you notice more emotional layers in the world, it can sometimes feel harder to participate in the lighter parts of life. Moments that others experience as simple can feel complicated. Social situations can occasionally feel exhausting rather than energizing. And sometimes there's a quiet sense of distance, like you're participating in the same life as everyone else, but processing it through a slightly older lens. What's interesting, though, is that this distance often changes over time. As life continues, People gradually accumulate the experiences that naturally deepen emotional awareness. Moments of loss, moments of responsibility, moments where understanding human behavior becomes unavoidable. And slowly, the gap begins to close. Things that once made you feel different begin to make you relatable. The perspective that once felt isolating becomes something others seek out. Not because it was superior, but because it was simply developed earlier. And for many people who feel emotionally older than their age, there's an important realization waiting quietly beneath the surface. The way your mind processes the world isn't a mistake. It's a particular configuration of awareness, a nervous system that learned to notice patterns early, a perspective shaped by observation and emotional depth. And while it can sometimes make you feel out of sync with the pace of the people around you, it also means you're seeing layers of life that others will eventually learn to recognize in their own time. If this experience feels familiar, there's a good chance there are other patterns in the way you think and feel that follow the same quiet logic, patterns that many people carry without fully understanding. And once you start noticing them, the story your mind has been telling about itself often begins to make a lot more sense.